People like you belong on your knees cleaning floors, not discussing finances. Alexander Reed's champagne splashed onto Leila Jackson's uniform, deliberate, dismissive. He never bothered to look down at the black maid with the Harvard MBA. His mistake. A financial document slipped from Reed's Italian suit pocket. Leila's fingers closed around it. Falsified numbers that would collapse his empire. The same fraud that had destroyed her Wall Street career when she'd reported it. Mr. Katsumoto noticed her reaction. Their eyes met briefly as she tucked the paper away. In exactly 6 minutes, this billionaire's empire would crumble at the hands of the woman he wouldn't even look in the eye. Manhattan glittered 75 floors below through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Reed's penthouse. The evening skyline transformed the city into a carpet of jewels, a view reserved for those who commanded fortunes. Alexander Reed, at 45, had built Reed Capital into a financial empire through acquisitions both brilliant and brutal. Tonight's cocktail party would finalize his latest triumph, a $100 million deal that would cement his reputation as Wall Street's most ruthless winner. Leila Jackson moved silently around the penthouse's perimeter, collecting empty glasses and wiping invisible smudges from surfaces that cost more than her annual salary. At 32, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her gray uniform. Her hands, which once flew over keyboards calculating complex financial models at Goldman Sachs, now held cleaning supplies. Her Harvard MBA, once her pride, had become an invisible weight she carried in silence. "Champagne, Mr. Reed?" A server approached the billionaire, who stood at the center of an admiring circle. Reed's custom Italian suit probably cost more than Leila's entire wardrobe. His silver-streaked hair was expertly cut to project authority while disguising his receding hairline. "The Krug Grande Cuvée, not that domestic swill," Reed said without looking at the server. "These gentlemen represent over $2 billion in investment capital. They deserve the best." The server retreated, face carefully neutral. Leila recognized the expression. She wore it daily since taking this job 3 months ago with Manhattan Elite Services, the premium cleaning company that served New York's wealthiest residents. Hiroshi Katsumoto stood slightly apart from Reed's entourage. The investment fund director from Tokyo commanded respect through quiet confidence rather than bluster. His dark suit was impeccable but understated, his posture perfect. Leila had noticed how people naturally lowered their voices in his presence, as though his attention were a valuable commodity. "Mr. Reed," Katsumoto said, "the projection models for the acquisition show impressive returns, but I have questions about the valuation metrics." Reed flashed his practiced smile. "That's why I studied at Harvard, Mr. Katsumoto. These models incorporate proprietary algorithms my team has refined over 15 years. He gestured expansively, nearly hitting Leila as she moved past. He didn't notice or apologize. "The forecasted growth seems ambitious," Katsumoto persisted. "Ambitious is what built America," Reed laughed. "Conservatism is why Japan's economy has stagnated." Several men chuckled, but Katsumoto's expression remained unchanged. Leila kept her focus on the crystal vase she was repositioning, but her mind automatically processed the financial jargon flowing around her. Old habits died hard. Before her fall from grace, she'd been senior financial analyst at Meridian Partners, specializing in merger and acquisition valuations. Her attention to detail had made her a rising star until it destroyed her career. She'd discovered accounting irregularities in a major acquisition target, the kind that turned promising investments into financial sinkholes. When she reported her findings to her superiors, she'd expected gratitude. Instead, she received a late-night termination notice and a reputation as a troublemaker. 3 months later, Meridian was acquired by Reed Capital, her former colleagues scattered to the wind, and the irregularities buried in complex financial footnotes. Now she worked 2 jobs, cleaning during the day and night shifts at an all-night diner on weekends, to support her ailing mother and pay down student loans that had financed her now useless education. The Brookfield assets are particularly undervalued, Reed continued, leading the investors toward a holographic display of financial projections. Their management missed opportunities in 3 key markets. Leila recognized the company name instantly. Brookfield had been Meridian's acquisition target, the same one where she'd found the irregularities. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down a side table. "Their debt-to-equity ratio concerns me," Katsumoto said quietly. Reed dismissed this with a wave. "On paper only. We've structured the deal to leverage tax advantages that effectively reduce that exposure by 30%. Leila fought to maintain her neutral expression. Reed's claim was financial nonsense, the kind that sounded impressive to amateur investors, but would collapse under professional scrutiny. She moved to clean near the display, careful to remain in the background as Reed continued his presentation. The familiar financial terms flooded her with memories of her former life board meetings, due diligence reports, late nights building models that had to balance to the penny. "Champagne for our esteemed guests," Reed announced as servers circulated with fresh glasses. "To the future of Reed Capital and the most profitable quarter in our history." Glasses clinked. Leila bent to pick up a discarded napkin, her eyes briefly meeting Katsumoto's. The investor's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than normal. She quickly looked away. "You there," Reed suddenly said, gesturing toward Leila. "Be careful around the presentation area. That technology costs more than you'll earn in a decade." The room didn't quite fall silent, but conversations paused. Leila straightened, nodding once without meeting Reed's eyes. "Yes, sir." "Alexander has always had expensive toys," remarked Victor Harrington, another investor. "Remember that yacht in Monaco?" Conversation resumed, flowing around Leila as though she were furniture. She continued her work, moving methodically through the room, listening. "Katsumoto's fund is the key," one man murmured to another near the bar where Leila was collecting glasses. "If he commits, the others will follow. 100 million minimum." Reed's betting everything on this, leveraged to the hilt. Leila stored this information automatically. Financial intelligence had once been her currency. Now it was just background noise in a life stripped of professional purpose. "Mr. Reed," Katsumoto was saying, "could we examine the projected cash flow statements more closely? The figures on page 17 seem inconsistent with the revenue forecasts." A flicker of annoyance crossed Reed's face. "Of course, though I assure you they've been triple-checked. Perhaps we should move to the conference room for a more detailed discussion." Leila noticed the slight tension in Reed's shoulders. She'd seen it countless times in executives when their numbers were questioned. As the group moved toward the adjoining room, she caught fragments of their conversation. Quarterly projections based on historical performance. Integration costs underestimated by at least. Standard industry metrics adjusted for current market. In the momentary emptiness of the main room, Leila paused, allowing herself a deep breath. The technical conversation had awakened something she'd tried to suppress her financial analyst's mind, which still processed numbers and projections automatically, spotting weaknesses and opportunities. She glimpsed the projection display Reed had left active. The figures seemed to call to her. 3 months of cleaning floors hadn't erased 15 years of financial training. Her eyes scanned balance sheets, cash flow statements, valuation metrics, absorbing information she had no business knowing. A small error caught her eye, then another. Not obvious mistakes, but subtle flaws in the formulas underlying the projections. The kind only someone with deep technical knowledge would recognize. The same pattern she'd found at Meridian. Assumptions built on optimistic projections, leveraged returns calculated using outdated risk assessments, debt restructuring that masked fundamental weaknesses. "Excuse me." Leila jumped, nearly dropping her cleaning caddy. A server stood beside her. "Mr. Reed wants the main room prepared for dessert service in 20 minutes. "Of course," Leila replied, forcing her attention back to her assigned role. She had no right to those financial models, no place in that conference room. Her opinion, once valued at hundreds of dollars an hour, was now worth less than the cleaning solution in her spray bottle. As she arranged the dessert tables, Leila heard raised voices from the conference room. The door opened and the investors emerged, their expressions tense. Reed followed, his practiced smile strained at the edges. "Gentlemen, these are standard growth projections," he was saying. "Every successful deal looks ambitious on paper. My analysts will need to review these figures overnight," Katsumoto replied calmly, "particularly the leveraged return calculations." Reed's smile remained fixed, but Leila recognized the panic behind his eyes. She'd seen it in her former boss's expression when she'd questioned their numbers. "Certainly, though I assure you they're rock solid. Harvard Business Review actually featured our valuation methodology last year." Reed gestured toward the bar. "More champagne while we continue our discussion?" As the group dispersed through the room, Leila continued her work, invisible once more. Reed's financial emperor had just received his first challenge, and he was scrambling to maintain the illusion of certainty. She knew the feeling. 3 years ago, she'd been the rising star, confidently presenting her own models until asking the wrong questions cost her everything. Now, as she wiped down countertops and emptied small trash receptacles, she realized Reed's empire might be built on the same quicksand that had swallowed her career. The knowledge gave her no satisfaction. Financial mistakes didn't just affect billionaires, they destroyed ordinary people's jobs, savings, and futures. She knew that better than most. The conference room door remained open as Reed guided Katsumoto and 2 other key investors back to the financial displays. Leila worked nearby, emptying decorative wastebaskets while keeping her face carefully neutral. "The accelerated depreciation schedule is aggressive but within regulatory guidelines," Reed explained, gesturing toward the holographic projections. "This approach maximizes tax advantages while maintaining GAAP compliance." Katsumoto studied the numbers with quiet intensity. "Your debt service coverage ratio seems optimistic, given the current interest rate environment." A flash of annoyance crossed Reed's face before his smile reasserted itself. "Our Treasury team has secured favorable terms based on our company's credit rating. We've stress-tested these models against 200 basis points of unexpected increase." Leila kept her eyes down, but her mind automatically flagged the inconsistency. Reed's model couldn't possibly withstand that level of stress testing. The leverage ratios were already at the upper limits of sustainability. "Perhaps we could see those stress test results," Katsumoto asked. Reed hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Of course. My assistant has prepared that documentation. I'll have it sent over first thing tomorrow." Leila recognized the deflection technique. Tomorrow meant time to create documents that didn't currently exist. "I'd prefer to review them now before our partners in Tokyo open for trading," Katsumoto persisted. Reed's professional veneer cracked slightly. "My team is preparing those specific documents for distribution. They'll be comprehensive and—" "The model's fundamental assumption appears flawed," Katsumoto interrupted gently, pointing to a line of figures. "This projected revenue growth contradicts the market contraction forecasts on page 23. The room tensed. Reed turned to the display, trying to locate the discrepancy. Leila could see his confidence wavering as he scrolled through the projection tabs. He was searching for something, likely his missing notes. "A momentary calculation artifact," Reed said, voice tight. "The final integrated model reconciles these differences through the proprietary algorithm I mentioned." He turned abruptly, arms sweeping outward in emphasis, and collided with Leila. His champagne splashed across her uniform and the floor. "For God's sake!" Reed snapped. "Watch where you're standing!" The room fell silent. Leila froze, champagne dripping from her gray uniform onto the marble floor. "My apologies, sir," she said automatically, eyes lowered, already reaching for her cleaning cloth. "This is exactly why service staff should remain in the background until needed," Reed continued, addressing the room as though explaining a business principle. "Proximity without presence, that's what we pay for." No one spoke. Leila knelt to clean the spill, her cheeks burning with humiliation. If you understood finance instead of floor soap, Reed added with a tight laugh, you'd be on this side of the conversation. Katsumoto's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Please continue with your explanation of the revenue projections, Mr. Reed, he said after a moment. Particularly the reconciliation between the growth assumptions and market contraction forecasts. Reed turned back to the display, visibly relieved to return to business. As I was saying, our proprietary algorithm. As Leila cleaned the spilled champagne, something caught her eye, a folded paper under the edge of the sofa. Reed's missing notes. She recognized the distinctive blue paper he'd been consulting earlier. With practiced efficiency, she wiped the floor while simultaneously palming the folded sheet. Years of financial training made her instinctively scan its contents. Handwritten calculations, margin notes, reminder points for the presentation, and there, in the corner, the true debt leverage ratios. Numbers that contradicted everything Reed had been saying. Reed was not just optimistic in his projections, he was deliberately misleading his investors. The actual figures showed the acquisition target was significantly overvalued, the debt structure precarious, and the proposed returns mathematically impossible to achieve. It was Meridian, all over again. The same pattern that had destroyed her career when she'd tried to report it. Leila's hand trembled slightly. She should return the paper to Reed or simply ignore it. This wasn't her problem. She was here to clean, not to evaluate financial models or protect billionaire investors from their own mistakes. But as she tucked the paper into her pocket, a different calculation ran through her mind. How many jobs would be lost when this house of cards collapsed? How many pension funds invested in Katsumoto's portfolio would suffer? How many careers would be destroyed by financial negligence masked as brilliance? Her own bitter experience provided the answer. Leila stood, champagne wiped away, decision made. She had lost everything once for speaking truth to power. What more could they take from her now? The integrated cash flow projections demonstrate sustainable growth across all 5 business units, Reed continued, his confidence returning as he navigated through complex financial slides. The investors clustered around the display, their expressions varying from interested to skeptical. Leila moved to the far side of the room, methodically wiping down surfaces while processing the information on the paper now hidden in her pocket. The numbers confirmed her suspicions. Reed's entire presentation was built on manipulated data. His actual notes showed leverage ratios nearly double what he was presenting and growth projections that contradicted market realities. These acquisition targets have been underperforming for 3 consecutive quarters, Katsumoto observed, pointing to a chart. Yet your model shows immediate revenue acceleration post-acquisition. What operational changes support this projection? Reed's smile tightened. Our management approach historically generates 30% efficiency improvements in the first year. It's a proven methodology. Proven where? Another investor asked. Your last acquisition showed mixed results at best. Temporary market headwinds, Reed dismissed. The underlying fundamentals were sound. Leila kept her expression neutral as she worked. The temporary headwinds Reed referenced had been the collapse of Meridian Partners, her former employer, after Reed Capital's acquisition. Over 300 people had lost their jobs, including her. The sound fundamentals had been anything but. Reed's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowning. Excuse me, gentlemen. A quick word with my team. He stepped away, dialing rapidly. Where the hell is the stress test documentation? He hissed into the phone, voice low but audible to Leila as she worked nearby. Katsumoto's asking questions about the debt leverage model. No, I need it now, not tomorrow. Find it or create it, I don't care which. He ended the call, composing himself before returning to the group. Leila noticed his hand patting his pocket looking for the missing notes. A flash of panic crossed his face when he realized they weren't there. Mr. Reed, Katsumoto said as Reed rejoined them. These projected returns seem to assume interest rates will remain stable. Current Fed signals suggest otherwise. Our models factor in potential rate fluctuations, Reed replied smoothly. Even a 75 basis point increase would maintain profitability within acceptable parameters. Leila nearly dropped her cleaning bottle. The notes in her pocket explicitly stated that even a 50 basis point increase would push several leveraged positions into dangerously negative territory. Reed wasn't just being optimistic. He was lying outright. Let's move to the risk assessment section, Reed continued, swiping through slides. His movements grew more abrupt as he searched for information he'd had in his missing notes. Something wrong? Katsumoto asked. Not at all. My team is sending additional documentation momentarily. Reed's confident smile had become fixed, almost rigid. Another investor spoke up. Perhaps we should reconvene tomorrow after we've all had time to review the complete data package. Unnecessary, Reed said quickly. Everything you need to make an informed decision is right here. He gestured expansively, then checked his watch. Though I understand if jet lag is a factor for our international friends. The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Several investors exchanged glances. I assure you, Mr. Reed, fatigue isn't clouding my judgment, Katsumoto replied evenly. It's the discrepancy between your growth projections and the underlying revenue metrics that concerns me. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Reed's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, then turned back to the investors with renewed confidence. My team has prepared the stress test documentation. It will be displayed momentarily. He tapped his tablet, then frowned when nothing happened. Technical difficulties. Perhaps we should take a brief refreshment break while this is resolved. As the group dispersed, Reed cornered one of his assistants who had just arrived. Find those projections and find my notes. Now. The young man hurried away, face pale. Leila continued her methodical cleaning, moving closer to where Katsumoto now stood alone, examining the financial displays with quiet intensity. These numbers don't align, he murmured to himself in Japanese, not realizing Leila understood the language from 3 years of working with Japanese financial institutions. Reed approached a small group of investors near the bar. Harvard Business School doesn't teach timidity, he said loudly enough for Katsumoto to hear. Some investment philosophies remain trapped in outdated conservative models that miss opportunity. The targeted comment hung in the air. Leila watched Katsumoto's expression remain impassive, though his posture stiffened slightly. Reed's assistant returned, whispering something that made Reed's face darken. He checked his empty pockets again, then scanned the room, eyes briefly passing over Leila without recognition. Gentlemen, Reed announced, let's reconvene. My team has identified a minor formatting issue in the presentation. The fundamentals remain solid. As the investors gathered again, Reed's demeanor had changed. The smooth confidence was replaced by a more aggressive stance. Before we continue, I want to emphasize that this acquisition strategy represents the pinnacle of modern financial engineering. It's not for the timid or traditionally minded. Katsumoto raised an eyebrow. Is financial prudence now considered timidity, Mr. Reed? In today's market? Often, yes. Reed gestured toward the displays. These models reflect advanced techniques taught at Harvard's executive program. They might seem aggressive to conventional analysis. The Harvard reference, his third of the evening, landed heavily. Leila continued working, face carefully blank despite the burning in her chest. Her own Harvard MBA, earned with honors while working 2 jobs, was now worthless paper thanks to men like Reed. Perhaps, said Katsumoto, we could focus on the specific calculations rather than credentials. Reed's smile vanished. Of course. Though one needs certain credentials to fully appreciate the sophisticated approach. He turned toward where Leila was cleaning. It's like explaining quantum physics to someone who cleans floors. Some perspectives require proper education. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Leila kept working, face burning, invisible yet somehow the center of attention through Reed's cruel comparison. "An unusual analogy," Katsumoto said after a moment. "In my experience, intelligence and insight often appear in unexpected places." Reed waved dismissively. "A pleasant sentiment. But serious finance requires serious training." He gestured toward Leila without looking at her. "I doubt our cleaning staff could calculate a basic interest payment, let alone understand leveraged acquisition modeling." Leila's hands trembled slightly as she continued working. The paper in her pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. Reed had just publicly humiliated her to deflect from his own failing presentation. The room remained uncomfortably silent as investors avoided eye contact with both Reed and Leila. "Now," Reed said briskly, "returning to the projected returns on page 42. But something had shifted in the room. The casual cruelty had left a sour taste that no amount of financial projections could wash away. Katsumoto's gaze lingered on Leila for a moment longer than casual, a thoughtful assessment that made her heart race. For the first time that evening, she felt seen rather than merely looked through. "These projected returns assume a market expansion that contradicts your own industry analysis on page 17, Katsumoto said, his voice measured but persistent. The room had grown increasingly tense as Reed's presentation continued to unravel under scrutiny. Reed's composed facade was cracking. He swiped through slides with growing frustration, searching for information that would have been in his missing notes. "The integrated model reconciles those apparent contradictions through our proprietary valuation metrics," Reed insisted, though his explanation lacked his earlier confidence. "Forgive me," said Victor Harrington, another significant investor, "but these numbers simply don't add up. The debt-to-equity ratio alone raises serious concerns about sustainability." "Perhaps we should postpone this discussion," suggested another investor, checking his watch. "It's getting late, and these discrepancies warrant a fresh review." Reed's expression hardened. "There are no discrepancies, gentlemen. Just sophisticated financial engineering that requires proper understanding." His knuckles whitened around his tablet. "My team has built these models using advanced techniques developed at Harvard's Financial Analytics program. The methodology is sound. Methodology means little if the underlying assumptions are flawed," Katsumoto replied quietly. "The projected cash flows appear fundamentally incompatible with current market conditions." The room fell silent. Reed's presentation was imploding, and everyone knew it. The $100 million deal that was supposed to be his crowning achievement was slipping away with each questioned calculation. "I've been reviewing these same financial markets for 20 years, Reed said, voice tight with controlled anger. "With all due respect, Mr. Katsumoto, some of these concepts require specialized expertise that—" "Perhaps we're overcomplicating things," Katsumoto interrupted, his calm voice cutting through Reed's increasingly defensive tone. "Let's return to basics. The acquisition target shows declining quarterly returns for 3 consecutive periods. Your model projects immediate 18% growth post-acquisition. What specific operational changes justify this reversal?" Reed stared at the display, visibly struggling to reconstruct the rationale that had been in his missing notes. "Our management approach historically generates significant efficiencies through strategic restructuring and firing people," Leila said quietly, almost to herself. The room froze. All eyes turned to her, including Reed's, whose expression transformed from confusion to rage as he realized she had spoken. "Excuse me," he said, voice dangerously low. Leila's heart hammered in her chest. She hadn't meant to speak aloud, but the words had escaped before she could stop them. She stood perfectly still, cleaning cloth in hand, caught in the sudden spotlight of attention. "I believe the cleaning staff has an opinion on financial restructuring," Reed said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps she'd like to explain leveraged acquisition modeling to us as well." Nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Leila felt heat rising to her face, but something had broken inside her, the dam that had held back her professional knowledge and dignity for months of silent humiliation. "Actually," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I would." The chuckles died instantly. Reed's face flushed dark red. "Get back to work or leave," he snapped. "This discussion is for financial professionals, not the cleaning crew." Katsumoto studied Leila with new interest. "What were you saying about firing people?" he asked, ignoring Reed's outburst. Leila hesitated, standing at the precipice of a decision that would change everything. She could apologize, retreat into invisibility, and keep her desperately needed job. Or she could speak the truth that was burning inside her. The memory of 300 colleagues losing their livelihoods after Reed's last acquisition made the choice clear. The 18% growth projection is based on eliminating approximately 40% of the acquisition target's workforce while maintaining the same productivity levels, Leila said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's mathematically impossible without technological automation that doesn't exist in that industry sector." The room fell completely silent. Reed stared at her with a mixture of shock and fury. "How dare you interrupt a private financial discussion with nonsense?" he sputtered. "You're fired." "Get out immediately." "Mr. Reed," Katsumoto said quietly, "I'd like to hear what she has to say." "This is absurd," Reed protested. "She's a cleaning woman." "And yet," Katsumoto replied, "she appears to understand your financial model better than you've explained it." He turned to Leila. "Please continue." Leila set down her cleaning supplies and straightened her shoulders, stepping fully into the person she'd buried beneath months of humiliation. "The model assumes 3 impossible conditions," she said, pointing to the display. "First, that interest rates will remain stable despite clear Federal Reserve signals to the contrary. Second, that workforce reductions won't impact productivity. And third, that market share will increase despite industry contraction." Reed's face had gone from red to white. "Security!" he called out. "Remove this person immediately." "Wait," said Victor Harrington, raising a hand. "These are precisely the concerns I've been trying to articulate." "How do you know this?" he asked Leila. "Because I've built these exact models," she replied. "Before I cleaned penthouses, I was senior financial analyst specializing in M&A valuation at Meridian Partners." Recognition dawned on several faces. Meridian's collapse after Reed Capital's acquisition had made financial headlines. "Harvard MBA, class of 2019, graduated with honors," she continued. "I worked at Goldman Sachs before joining Meridian, where I specialized in merger financial due diligence." "This is preposterous," Reed interrupted. "You expect us to believe—" "Leila Jackson," Katsumoto said suddenly. "You wrote a paper on sustainable valuation metrics that was published in the Financial Analysis Journal." Leila's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes." "I found it quite insightful," Katsumoto said with a slight nod. "Particularly your model for balancing short-term restructuring gains against long-term organizational stability costs." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Reed's authority was evaporating as Leila's credibility solidified. "If I may," Leila said, gesturing toward the financial display, "there are fundamental flaws in this valuation approach that any investor should be aware of before committing capital." "This is still my presentation," Reed interjected, stepping between Leila and the investors. "Whatever credentials she claims to have are irrelevant. This woman is a janitor in my home, not a financial advisor." "I'm both, actually," Leila replied, her voice steady. "And I believe Mr. Katsumoto asked about specific operational changes that would justify your growth projections. You haven't answered that question." "Because proprietary—" "There aren't any," Leila interrupted. "I've reviewed every slide in your presentation as I've cleaned this room. The model depends entirely on workforce reduction and accounting adjustments that mask fundamental weaknesses in the acquisition target." A murmur spread through the group of investors. Reed's face contorted with rage. "Mr. Katsumoto," Leila continued, turning to the Japanese investor, The debt service coverage ratio shown on page 38 is calculated using an outdated interest rate assumption. Even a 50 basis point increase would push several leveraged positions into negative territory. How could you possibly know that? Reed demanded. Those calculations aren't even displayed in the presentation. Leila reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded blue paper. Because it's right here in your notes, Mr. Reed. The ones you dropped earlier. The room went completely silent. Reed stared at his missing notes with dawning horror. You stole my private financial documents, he said, voice shaking with anger. I picked them up from the floor when you dropped them, Leila corrected. And they confirm what I suspected from watching your presentation. You're misleading these investors with manipulated projections. Give me those immediately, Reed demanded, stepping toward her. Oh. Katsumoto raised a hand. I'd like to see those notes, if Ms. Jackson doesn't mind. Leila handed the paper to Katsumoto, who studied it carefully, his expression revealing nothing. May I? Victor Harrington asked, and Katsumoto passed him the notes. Reed watched helplessly as his carefully crafted deception circulated among the very investors he'd intended to mislead. These figures contradict almost every major projection in the presentation, Harrington said finally, looking up at Reed with narrowed eyes. The actual leverage is nearly double what you've presented. Context is important, Reed said desperately. Those are preliminary calculations that accurately reflect the true financial state of this deal, Leila finished for him. A deal structured almost identically to the Meridian acquisition that resulted in 300 people losing their jobs while executives received 8-figure bonuses. The investors exchanged glances. Reed's credibility was collapsing in real time. If I may, Leila said, stepping toward the financial display, I can show you exactly where the model breaks down. By all means, Katsumoto said, gesturing toward the screen. With the confidence of someone returning to her element, Leila navigated through the financial projections. Her fingers flew across the display with practiced precision, highlighting discrepancies and explaining complex financial concepts with clarity and authority. The fundamental flaw is here, she said, isolating a section of the model. The cash flow projection assumes cost reductions from workforce elimination without accounting for the corresponding productivity drop. It's mathematically impossible to maintain output levels with 40% fewer workers unless there's technological automation, which isn't budgeted anywhere in the capital expenditure plans. She continued her analysis, methodically dismantling Reed's financial house of cards while the investors watched with growing interest and respect. Reed stood to the side, his face a mask of contained fury as his $100 million deal disintegrated before his eyes. Furthermore, Leila continued, the debt structure creates vulnerability to even minor interest rate fluctuations. A 75 basis point increase, which the Fed has signaled is likely, would trigger covenant violations on at least 3 major credit facilities. That's simply not true, Reed interjected desperately. It's right here in your own notes, Mr. Reed, Victor Harrington replied, holding up the blue paper. In your handwriting. Those are preliminary worst-case scenarios, not— The date on these notes is yesterday, Harrington continued, and they're marked Final Pre-Presentation Review. This wasn't preliminary, this was your actual assessment. Reed fell silent, outmaneuvered and exposed. Ms. Jackson, Katsumoto said, in your professional opinion, what would be a more realistic valuation model for this acquisition? Leila took a deep breath. This was familiar territory, the world she'd inhabited before her career's destruction. With your permission, I can reconstruct a more realistic model based on current market conditions and actual performance metrics. Please do, Katsumoto said, nodding to the display. For the next 10 minutes, Leila built a financial model from scratch, explaining each assumption and calculation as she worked. The room watched in silence as her Harvard training and Goldman Sachs experience manifested in a masterclass of financial analysis. This revised model, she concluded, displaying the final projections, shows the acquisition could still be profitable, but at a purchase price, approximately 30% lower than currently proposed, with a more conservative debt structure and realistic operational integration timeline. The room remained silent as the investors absorbed her analysis. Reed stood frozen, watching his deal and his reputation transform before his eyes. "That was remarkably thorough," Katsumoto said finally. "Thank you, Miss Jackson." A ripple of murmured agreement spread through the investors. For the first time that evening, they were looking at Leila, really seeing her with professional respect rather than the invisibility reserved for service staff. "I believe," Katsumoto continued, "we should reconsider the terms of this proposal in light of Ms. Jackson's analysis." The weight of the moment hung in the air. The cleaning woman in a gray uniform had just dismantled a billionaire's financial deception through sheer competence and courage. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. "This is completely inappropriate," Reed finally managed, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "This woman has no right to access or comment on confidential financial information. She's violated her employment contract and the basic standards of professional conduct." "I'd say the standards of professional conduct were already compromised," Victor Harrington replied, holding up Reed's notes. "These deliberate misrepresentations would constitute securities fraud if this were a public offering." "Theoretical projections are not misrepresentations," Reed countered, attempting to regain control. "Every financial model contains assumptions, and the assumptions are documented right here as intentionally misleading," Harrington interrupted, tapping the blue paper. "Your own handwritten notes explicitly acknowledge the leverage ratios are too high to disclose and instruct your team to adjust the presentation model while keeping the actual figures separate." Reed's face drained of color. His own words, in his own handwriting, had become his undoing. "Ms. Jackson," Katsumoto said, turning away from Reed, "you mentioned you worked at Meridian Partners before it was acquired by Reed Capital. Could you elaborate on that connection?" Leila stood perfectly straight, no longer assuming the deferential posture of cleaning staff. The transformation was remarkable, from invisible service worker to commanding financial expert in the span of minutes. "I was senior financial analyst at Meridian, specializing in M&A valuations," she explained. "During due diligence for a major acquisition, I discovered accounting irregularities that would have made the deal unsustainable. When I reported my findings to management, I was terminated without explanation." She paused, looking directly at Reed for the first time. 3 months later, Reed Capital acquired Meridian, implemented the exact acquisition I had flagged as dangerous, then laid off 300 employees when the projections inevitably failed. The executives who had ignored my warnings received multi-million-dollar severance packages. The rest of us received nothing. A heavy silence fell over the room. The personal connection between Leila's fall from financial grace and Reed's business practices cast everything in a new light. "That's a creative interpretation of business decisions made years ago," Reed said dismissively. "Meridian's management made their own choices. My firm simply provided capital and strategic direction after the acquisition." "Your firm provided misleading projections that guaranteed failure," Leila corrected, her voice steady. "The same pattern evident in tonight's presentation." Reed's professional mask slipped completely. "You were fired because you were wrong," he snapped. "Your analysis was flawed, your concerns overblown, and your attitude inappropriate, just as it is now." "If I was wrong," Leila replied calmly, "why did the exact scenarios I warned about come to pass? Why did 300 people lose their livelihoods? Why did Meridian's value drop 60% within 18 months of your acquisition?" Reed had no answer. The room remained silent as the confrontation reached its peak. "I think," said Katsumoto after a moment, "we should address the financial model before us rather than past history." He turned to Leila. "Your revised projections suggest the acquisition could still be viable at a significantly reduced valuation. Could you elaborate on the operational assumptions that would make this successful?" Leila nodded, grateful for the return to professional analysis. She moved to the financial display and began explaining her alternative approach, highlighting sustainable integration practices, realistic productivity metrics, and responsible debt structures. Reid watched in mounting disbelief as his investors engaged with Leila's presentation, asking questions and nodding at her responses. His $100 million deal was being dismantled and reconstructed without him, by a woman who had been invisibly cleaning his penthouse an hour earlier. "This is my deal," he interjected desperately. "My company, my acquisition target, my investors. You can't simply—" "We're not your investors yet, Mr. Reid," Harrington pointed out. "We're still in the due diligence phase, which Ms. Jackson has just significantly illuminated. With stolen information!" Reid's composure had completely abandoned him now. "Security!" he called again. "Remove this woman immediately!" No one moved. The security personnel stationed by the elevator looked uncertainly toward Katsumoto and the other investors, who were clearly engaged with Leila's presentation. "Mr. Reid," Katsumoto said quietly, "I believe escalating this situation would be unwise. Ms. Jackson has provided valuable financial insights that directly impact our investment decisions. She's a cleaning woman who stole my notes. She's a Harvard MBA and former Goldman Sachs analyst who identified critical flaws in your financial projections," Katsumoto corrected. "The fact that she's currently employed in maintenance services doesn't diminish her financial expertise." Reid looked around the room, searching for allies and finding none. The investors who had been hanging on his every word an hour ago were now focused entirely on Leila's analysis. The power dynamic had completely inverted. "This is absurd," he said, voice rising. "I've built $1 billion investment firm. I've completed over 30 successful acquisitions. I won't be lectured on financial modeling by someone who actually understands the math," Leila suggested. The room fell completely silent. For a moment, it seemed Reid might physically lash out. Then, with visible effort, he controlled himself. "Fine," he said coldly. "Since you're all so impressed with the cleaning staff's financial acumen, I'll leave you to it. My team will be in touch tomorrow when you've come to your senses." He moved toward the elevator. "Before you go, Mr. Reid," Katsumoto called after him, "I should inform you that, based on Ms. Jackson's analysis and your own contradictory documents, our fund will be withdrawing from consideration of this investment opportunity as currently structured." Reid froze mid-stride. "As will Harrington Capital," added Victor Harrington. "And Westlake Partners," said another investor. One by one, the potential investors distanced themselves from Reid's deal. The $100 million that had been virtually guaranteed at the beginning of the evening evaporated in a cascade of polite but firm rejections. Reid turned slowly, his face ashen. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said. "This deal won't be available tomorrow." "That's probably for the best," Katsumoto replied calmly. "However, we may be interested in a restructured proposal that addresses the concerns Ms. Jackson has identified." "With her involvement in the restructuring," Harrington added, looking at Leila with newfound respect. Reid stared in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Entirely serious," Katsumoto confirmed. "In fact, Ms. Jackson, I'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement with you to reassess this investment opportunity with more realistic parameters." Leila blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. "I would be interested in that discussion, Mr. Katsumoto." Reid watched the exchange with mounting fury. His $100 million deal wasn't just delayed or modified. It was being taken from him entirely and handed to the woman who had been cleaning his floors minutes earlier. "This is a coordinated attack on my company," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "A vendetta by a disgruntled former Meridian employee. You're all being manipulated." "The only manipulation here," Harrington said, "is documented in your own handwriting." He held up the blue notes again. "These speak for themselves." Reid had no response. His carefully constructed world of financial smoke and mirrors had collapsed completely. Ms. Jackson, Katsumoto said, turning away from Reed as though he were already gone. Would you be available to continue this discussion over dinner? I believe there's much more to explore in your alternative approach. I would be honored, Mr. Katsumoto, Leila replied, still processing the extraordinary turn of events. The room fell silent as Reed stood frozen, watching his investors gather around Leila. The cleaning woman had become the center of attention, while the billionaire had become irrelevant. Value isn't in your wallet, Mr. Reed, Leila said quietly. It's in your character. The simple truth hung in the air. Reed had no response. After a moment, he turned and walked stiffly to the elevator, leaving behind not just his $100 million deal, but the illusion of superiority that had defined his existence. As the elevator doors closed on Alexander Reed, the penthouse erupted in renewed conversation, all of it centered on Leila Jackson and her financial insights. In less than an hour, she had transformed from invisible servant to respected financial authority. The status flip was complete. The elevator doors had barely closed behind Reed when the energy in the room transformed. Investors who had barely acknowledged Leila's existence now crowded around her, business cards appearing from inside suit jackets. Your analysis was extraordinary, Victor Harrington said, handing Leila his card. Particularly impressive given the circumstances. Thank you, Leila replied, still adjusting to being addressed as a professional rather than service staff. She accepted the card with steady hands, though her heart raced at the sudden reversal of fortune. I'd like to continue our discussion about the revised valuation model, Katsumoto said. Perhaps you could join us for dinner. The restaurant downstairs has a private room available. Leila glanced down at her uniform, the gray maintenance outfit with the champagne stain still visible on the sleeve. I'm not exactly dressed for a business dinner, Mr. Katsumoto. Appearances are often misleading, he replied with a small smile, as tonight has demonstrated quite thoroughly. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the gathering. The same people who had looked through Leila for hours now hung on her every word. If you'll give me 15 minutes, she said, I can change into something more appropriate. I keep a change of clothes for my second job. Of course, Katsumoto nodded. We'll meet you in the lobby. As the investors gathered their things and moved toward the elevator, Leila stepped into the service area where maintenance staff stored their belongings. With hands that trembled slightly from residual adrenaline, she opened her locker and removed the neatly folded blouse and slacks she kept for her weekend diner shifts. The uniform she removed represented months of invisibility and quiet humiliation. As she changed, she felt the weight of that experience slipping away, replaced by the familiar confidence that had once defined her professional identity. When she emerged, the transformation was complete. Even in simple business casual attire, Leila carried herself differently. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes direct. The cleaning woman had vanished, revealing the financial analyst who had been there all along. The penthouse was empty now except for the remaining catering and service staff, who stared at her with undisguised amazement. Word had spread quickly about what had transpired. Did you really take down Alexander Reed? Whispered one of the servers as Leila gathered her purse. I just told the truth, Leila replied. The numbers did the rest. She took one last look around the penthouse, the space where her life had irrevocably changed course for the second time, first from success to failure, and now from invisibility back to recognition. As she stepped into the elevator that would take her down to meet her future, Leila Jackson left behind more than a uniform. She shed the weight of injustice that had bent her shoulders for too long. 3 months later, Leila sat in her new office on the 68th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, reviewing financial projections for Katsumoto Global Investments' latest acquisition target. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view remarkably similar to Reed's penthouse, but from the opposite side of Central Park. The transformation in her life had been swift and comprehensive. The morning after this penthouse confrontation, Katsumoto had offered her a position as senior investment strategist with a salary that allowed her to quit both the cleaning job and her weekend dinner shifts. Within weeks, her reputation in financial circles had been restored and enhanced by the now legendary story of how she had dismantled a billionaire's deception while wearing a cleaner's uniform. Her phone chimed with an incoming call. "Mom," she smiled, answering immediately. "How's the new physical therapist working out?" "Wonderful, sweetheart," her mother replied. "I still can't believe you convinced the insurance company to cover these treatments." "Not convinced, corrected," Leila replied. "They were misapplying their own policy guidelines." The same attention to detail that had made her a formidable financial analyst had proven equally effective in navigating healthcare bureaucracy. After ending the call, Leila opened her email to find a news alert she had been expecting. Reed Capital announces restructuring amid investment shortfall. The article detailed how Alexander Reed's investment firm had struggled after losing the $100 million deal that had been expected to anchor their fiscal year. Several major clients had withdrawn their funds following rumors of questionable valuation practices. Reed had been forced to sell his controlling interest to a consortium of investors at a significant discount. Leila felt no satisfaction in Reed's downfall, only a sense of justice for the 300 Meridian employees whose livelihoods had been sacrificed to financial manipulation. People whose names Reed had never bothered to learn, but whose faces Leila still remembered from company meetings and holiday parties. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Katsumoto entered, accompanied by a young woman in a simple but professional outfit who looked nervously around the expansive office. "Ms. Jackson, may I introduce Tanya Williams? She's the candidate I mentioned for our financial analyst position." Leila rose to greet them. "Ms. Williams, welcome. Please have a seat." As Katsumoto excused himself, Leila noticed Tanya's hesitation, the careful way she carried herself, the slight defensiveness in her posture. "Your resume is impressive," Leila began. "Howard University, graduated summa cum laude, internship at Morgan Stanley. But there's a gap in your employment history." Tanya's shoulders tensed. "Yes, I was at Breeden Financial for 8 months, but—" She paused, weighing her words. "I reported some irregularities in their mortgage-backed securities valuations. 2 weeks later, I was let go during a restructuring." Leila nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern. "And since then?" "Retail, customer service, whatever would pay the bills while I kept applying for financial positions." Tanya met Leila's eyes directly. No one wants to hire an analyst with a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. "I do," Leila said simply. Tanya blinked in surprise. "You do?" "I know exactly what it's like to be punished for professional integrity," Leila explained. 3 months ago, I was cleaning floors after being blacklisted for reporting similar concerns." She gestured toward the window. "Now, I'm helping build an investment firm founded on transparency and sustainable valuation models." She slid a folder across the desk. "This is our offer. Your experience, all of it, including the retail work, is valuable to us. Integrity and perseverance are assets this industry desperately needs." Tanya opened the folder, her eyes widening at the salary figure. "This is more than I expected." "It's what you're worth," Leila replied. "Something I had to relearn myself recently." After Tanya left with her offer letter, Leila returned to the window, gazing across the Manhattan skyline. In the distance, she could just make out the building where she had once worked as a cleaner. So many invisible people still moved through those spaces, their talents and potential unrecognized by the powerful figures whose messes they cleaned up. Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Jackson, your 4 o'clock is here." "The Meridian Alumni Association?" "Send them in," Leila replied. She turned to greet the 3 former colleagues who entered, all people who had lost their jobs in Reed's acquisition and subsequent layoffs. They were here to discuss the foundation Leila had established with her new Salaria Fund to provide retraining and placement services for financial professionals displaced by predatory acquisitions. As they settled around her conference table, Leila felt a profound sense of completion. Her journey from Harvard to humiliation and back to professional respect had come full circle, bringing with it the opportunity to extend the same lifeline to others. "Your value isn't determined by your uniform," she told the group as they began their discussion, "but by your character." In less than 6 months, Leila Jackson had gone from cleaning a billionaire's floors to rebuilding lives he had carelessly destroyed. It was more than revenge or redemption. It was restoration of a fundamental truth, that true worth could never be measured in dollars or status, but in integrity, perseverance, and the courage to speak truth to power. If you found yourself swept up in Leila's journey from invisibility to empowerment, take a moment to support PAP Stories. With just one click, you can help us continue creating powerful narratives that showcase real talent triumphing over privilege. Like this video to tell our algorithm you want more authentic status flip stories that celebrate competence and courage. Subscribe to PAP Stories for weekly tales of underdogs rising through sheer brilliance and determination. We deliver the satisfying moments of recognition you crave when true merit finally gets its spotlight.